The dead horse had been standing for 2 days. Eli Carver knew this because the animal's legs had locked at the knees in the way that only happened after the first hard freeze set into muscle and joint. The horse stood beside a split-rail fence post on the eastern edge of the frayed trace head, dropped low mane, stiff as iron wire, its dark coat dusted white from the last light snowfall 3 nights prior. The owner had cut the traces clean, a sharp blade deliberate work. Not panicked, then walked away south without looking back. Eli could read that much from the boot prints still visible in the older crust beneath the fresh powder. One set of tracks leading away. Nothing returning. He guided Colt past without stopping, though the old horse turned his head toward the frozen animal with the stillness that working horses reserve for the dead. Eli kept his eyes on the traces ahead. In the winter of 1891, the freight routes east of the Bitterroot Range had already taken 11 lives since October. Eli knew the count because he had carried 3 of those men down from the higher passes himself, wrapped in canvas, on the wagon bed, weight distributed careful so the load wouldn't shift on the switchbacks. He had not known any of them well. That had made the work easier, which was something he tried not to think about too long. The morning was pale and windless, the kind of cold that settled into everything evenly without announcing itself. No dramatic bite, no sharp gust, just a steady, patient removal of warmth from every exposed surface. The basalt ridgelines to the northwest rose dark against the sky, the color of old pewter. Snow covered the lower slopes in smooth, unbroken sheets, except where the rock faces jutted through black and blunt, interrupting the white like old bones pushing through thin skin. Eli was 38 years old. He had been running freight across Montana mountain country for nearly 2 decades. First as a loader for Dutch Reeves out of the Idaho line camps, then as a driver on his own contract out of Deer Lodge, then for 7 years as a man with his own wagon, his own animal, his own routes, and a wife who kept the ledger books in careful columns at the kitchen table every Sunday evening. That last part was finished now. Had been finished for 3 weeks and 2 days, though Eli had stopped counting with any precision somewhere around day 10, when counting began to feel like pressing a bruise to confirm it still hurt. May had died on a Tuesday. He remembered the day of the week with strange clarity, while the date itself kept sliding away from him. A Tuesday in late November, just before the second hard freeze of the season. The lamp had been burning low in the corner of the room because he had forgotten to trim the wick that morning, distracted by the delivery of another medicine order from the chemist in Missoula, a preparation the doctor described as promising, which Eli had learned by then was the word doctors used when they meant expensive. The lamp threw uneven light across the bed. May had been watching the ceiling for most of the afternoon, breathing with that careful rhythm that had replaced her ordinary breathing sometime in late October. Each inhale measured, each exhale released slowly as though she were spending from a limited account. He had been sitting in the chair beside the bed, still in his coat, because the room never quite reached warm enough with the iron stove working at capacity. May turned her head toward him without lifting it from the pillow. Her eyes were clear. They had stayed clear all the way through, which the doctor said was unusual for the stage of the illness, but which Eli suspected was simply May refusing to surrender that particular thing. Her voice, when it came, was quieter than it had been, but still recognizably hers, still carrying that slight dryness at the edges, that tone that had always suggested she found the world mildly but permanently surprising. She told him, "Stop worrying about the money, just in that. Not a comfort, not a reassurance, a directive delivered with the same brisk practicality she brought to most things." He had not answered. He had taken her hand instead, which was the most honest thing he could offer, since they both knew the money was already gone, and the worrying had shifted from debt to something that didn't have a clean word attached to it yet. By the time the lamp burned out that evening, she was gone. The wagon behind Eli carried everything that remained from that life. The inventory was not extensive. A bedroll and a canvas ground sheet, a cast iron skillet, 1 pot, 2 tin cups, a coil of rawhide rope approximately 40 feet good condition, a short-handled shovel with a cracked socket wrapped in wire to hold it together, a carpenter's hammer, a paper envelope of wire nails half full, a spare set of leather traces for Colt, a small axe, provisions for perhaps 4 more days at careful rationing, hard biscuit, dried beef, a cloth bag of dried beans he hadn't managed to cook, 2 small onions, a tin of molasses he'd had since Deer Lodge, and couldn't remember buying. One oil tarp folded across the top of the load that had been patched twice already and was developing a third location requiring attention along the left upper seam. The wagon itself was the thing that most told the story of the past 3 years. The left rear axle had been cracked since the Deer Lodge crossing in September, a crack he had meant to have properly repaired, but had wrapped instead with rawhide soaked in pine pitch, which had held well enough to keep working. The right front wheel sat crooked on its hub by perhaps 4 degrees, enough to cause a faint rhythmic wobble at anything above a slow walk. 3 of the sideboards on the left wall had warped badly from repeated wetting and drying over 2 seasons, opening gaps at the joints wide enough to pass a finger through. A man in Garnet Basin named Wallace Peck, a man with the talent some people had for being accurate at the worst possible moment, had looked at the whole assembly 2 weeks before May died and said it was nothing but firewood organized to look like a wagon. Eli had not argued. He had at that point other things occupying his attention. He had sold everything else. The second mule Jackson had gone to a freight operator in Missoula in August for $62, which had paid for 1 month of the medicine that didn't work. The storage contract on the Deer Lodge warehouse had been surrendered in September. The pocket watch his father had left him, silver case running a few minutes fast, which his father had considered a virtue, had gone to a jeweler in Helena in October for $14. The lease on the small house outside Garnet Basin had been returned to the landlord in November because May was too ill to be moved farther south, and the room above Halverson's dry goods store cost less per month and was closer to the chemist. He had paid for 3 months in advance because the landlord, a cautious man named Briggs, did not extend credit. By the time May died, the advance payment had 7 weeks left on it, which Eli had walked away from because there was nothing in that room he needed to bring with him, and he could not see a reason to stay for the full term, just to recover the value of the remaining weeks. The destination was Frank Carver's ranch in the Southern Valley, approximately 50 miles southeast of the current position on the freight trace. Frank was his father's brother's son, a relationship that in a closer family might have involved more regular contact, but which had mostly expressed itself through occasional letters, one shared meal in Butte 4 years prior, and the standing offer Frank had extended after May's diagnosis: "Come south when it's over. There's work and a room and no questions that need answering right away." It was the kind of offer that required a certain quality of man to make and a certain quality of stubbornness to delay accepting for as long as Eli had delayed it. He was aware of both these facts without being able to do much about either. He had left Garnet Basin 5 days ago. The first 2 days of travel had been uneventful by mountain winter standards: cold, slow-going, the trace passable but not kind. The third day had brought 6 inches of new snow that reduced visibility to a few hundred yards and turned the surface of the road into a soft, grabbing consistency that made Colt work twice as hard for half the distance. The fourth day had cleared, which brought its own problem. Temperatures dropped 15 degrees overnight, and everything that had softened in the snowfall refroze by morning into a crust sharp enough to cut at Colt's lower legs if the horse broke through it wrong. Eli had walked beside the wagon for most of that day, partly to reduce the load, partly because moving kept him functional in a way that sitting on the wagon bench increasingly did not. Today was the 5th day. The trace had improved through the morning-packed older snow with a surface that gave Colt decent purchase. They had covered nearly 8 miles since first light, which was better than the previous 2 days combined. The basalt ridgeline to the southwest was familiar territory to Eli. He had run this section of the route perhaps 30 times in 7 years of contract work, enough to know its tendencies without being able to claim full fluency with it. The ridge threw wind in particular ways depending on the storm's direction. In a northwest blow, the stone faces accelerated the gust into something like a compressed channel. In a straight north storm, the ridge created eddies that could build drifts in unexpected locations, places that looked passable from 50 yards, but turned out to be soft and deep enough to bury an axle. He was thinking about the condition of the packed snow ahead, reading the surface for the slight texture variations that indicated depth changes when Colt stopped. Not slowed, not hesitated. Stopped a complete, immediate cessation of forward movement, as though some mechanism connecting intention to motion had simply been switched off. Eli's hands had not moved on the reins. He had given no signal. The horse stood with its weight evenly distributed, neither braced for action nor relaxed. Its ears came up first, rotating forward toward the northern horizon with that precise tracking motion that working horses use for locating sounds too low or distant for human perception. Then the ears went flat, pressed back against the skull, in the posture that was not fear exactly, but the precursor to it, the position the body took before the mind had finished deciding what it was dealing with. Eli set the handbrake out of reflex and stood up on the wagon bench. The elevation gained him perhaps 2 feet of additional sightline, which was enough. The northern sky was wrong. Not dark darkness would have been the expected warning, the visible architecture of a storm building at a distance. This was something else. The sky to the north had gone flat. The normal depth and variation of winter cloud cover, the layering and movement that gave the sky its texture and implied distance, all of that had been replaced by something uniform and pressurized, a single plane of gray-white pressing down from the horizon toward the ridge. The color was not threatening in the conventional sense. It was simply without dimension, the way a wall has no depth, and the wall was moving. Eli had been 19 years old when Dutch Reeves showed him what to watch for in a mountain blizzard that was still an hour away. They had been running a repair crew on a freight bridge near Elk Creek Pass late November, working against an approaching storm to finish a deck patch before conditions made the bridge impassable. Dutch had stopped work without explanation. At mid-afternoon, walked to the north end of the bridge and stood there for nearly 2 minutes looking at the sky. He was a large man, Dutch Reeves wide through the chest, slow-moving with hands that seemed built for gripping iron rather than anything delicate. He had been working mountain freight and construction for 30 years by that point and had developed the unhurried confidence of a man who had been surprised by the mountains often enough to stop being surprised by the surprises. When he finally turned back to the crew, his assessment required 12 words. "We've got maybe 90 minutes. Finish what you can, then get under." Eli had looked at the sky and seen nothing that seemed to justify that reading. The clouds to the north looked like clouds. There was wind, but there had been wind all day. He said so. Dutch looked at him for a moment with an expression that was not quite patience and not quite dismissal, something between instruction and tolerance. "It's not what you see." Dutch pointed north, but not at the clouds. "Feel the air. Right now, feel it." Eli had tried. He had noticed, perhaps for the first time as something meaningful rather than incidental, that the wind had stopped. Not eased. Stopped. The air was perfectly still in a way that felt less like calm than like held breath. Dutch watched him process this. When the air goes dead still in open mountain country in November, it's not peace. It's being pulled somewhere else. Something big is eating all the air in the next county and pulling it north. That pull is the storm. The storm itself is what's coming behind it. They had finished the essential deck planking in 73 minutes. Dutch had made them take shelter in the covered end of the bridge with the equipment rather than try to reach the camp a half-mile east. The storm had hit 40 minutes later with a force that made the bridge structure flex enough to be felt through the soles of Eli's boots. They had spent 6 hours under that bridge deck in cramped cold shelter, waiting for the worst of it to pass. Dutch had used the time to explain in the patient detail of a man who had already decided a lesson was worth transmitting, carefully exactly how cold moved through spaces it shouldn't reach. That had been nearly 20 years ago. The specific words had stayed. Cold ain't the thing killing men. Moving air is. A room don't freeze all at once, it leaks to death. Standing on the wagon bench in the 5th day of the worst journey of his life, Eli felt the air go still. Not gradually. Between one moment and the next, the faint movement that had been present all morning, a slight, consistent pressure from the northwest, just enough to be felt against the left side of his face, simply ceased. The silence that followed was not ordinary silence. It was the silence of something very large, holding its breath. He had less than 90 minutes, possibly less than 60. The nearest structure with 4 walls and a roof was the Harmon Way Station 14 miles southeast on the freight trace. Eli did the arithmetic without sentiment. Colt pulling the loaded wagon on this surface in the condition the horse was currently in, after 5 days of hard travel, 4 miles per hour, was optimistic, 3.5 was honest. 14 miles at 3.5 miles per hour was 4 hours minimum, assuming no delays, no surface problems, no deterioration in conditions. The storm wall he could see pressing down on the northern horizon would reach this ridge in less than an hour and a half. The arithmetic didn't require refinement. The numbers said what they said. He stepped down from the bench, placed his left hand flat against Colt's neck just below the jaw where the pulse was accessible, and held it there until he could feel the horse's heartbeat. It was elevated not dramatically, but measurably above the resting baseline Eli had learned over years of working with this animal. Colt knew what was coming before Eli had finished calculating it. That was either reassuring or not, depending on how you chose to interpret the information. Eli looked at the land around him with the quality of attention that Dutch Reeves had spent 2 decades trying to teach the crews who worked for him, not looking for what was obviously there, but looking for what the terrain was offering that hadn't been requested. He turned slowly, taking inventory. The freight trace ran northeast to southwest across an exposed section of ridgeline with very little natural windbreak, the kind of section that was acceptable in ordinary conditions and murderous in a north blizzard. The sage flats to either side of the trace were open ground, no elevation, no shelter from terrain. To the east, the slope dropped away into a draw that would collect drifting snow and be impassable within an hour of the storm's arrival. To the west, the ground rose toward the basalt bluffs he had been using as a navigation landmark all morning dark. Irregular formations of ancient stone that broke through the ridgeline in a series of outcrops and hollows, running roughly north to south along the upper edge of the slope. He was not looking for a roof. He was not looking for trees, which in this part of the ridge were sparse and too small to provide meaningful windbreak. He was not looking for distance. Distance was not his friend right now. He was looking for walls. Eli tied Colt to the wagon wheel with enough lead to allow the horse to shift its weight, but not enough to let it turn, then walked toward the basalt bluffs at a pace between a fast walk and a controlled run. He needed to see what was there before he committed to moving the wagon. Moving the wagon was the irreversible decision. He needed to know what he was moving it toward before he made it. The first hollow he found faced almost directly north, a shallow scoop in the rock face, perhaps 12 feet across at the mouth with no overhang, and a floor that tilted slightly toward the opening. He rejected it without stopping. Wind moving down from the north would roll straight into that opening and accelerate through it. The hollow would function as a wind channel, not a shelter. The second hollow was deeper and more protected from direct northerly exposure, but the mouth spread nearly 22 feet across the front, too wide. With the materials available on the wagon, he could not seal an opening of that dimension against a serious blizzard. The gaps would remain, the wind would find them, and a shelter with gaps was not a shelter, it was a place to stand, while the cold killed you slightly more slowly than it would in the open. He kept moving along the base of the bluffs. The sky to the north had darkened in the time since he had left the wagon, not the flat gray from before, but something with actual mass to it, now black at the upper edge, where the high cloud was thickest, dropping to a moving gray-white at the base where the snow was already being driven horizontally along the ground. The storm was running. He had perhaps an hour, maybe less. The third hollow stopped him. It sat lower in the basalt face than the other two, as though the stone had been pressed inward rather than scooped out, a concave recess perhaps 15 feet across at the widest point, with thick walls of dark stone curving inward toward the back and a shallow rock overhang, extending perhaps 3 feet outward above the opening. The floor inside was dry basalt flat enough to stand on without difficulty. No drifted snow inside the hollow, which told him that even in previous storms, the wind had not penetrated this space deeply enough to deposit snow on the floor. The upper rock shelf showed no cracked or loose sections that might calve off under temperature stress or impact loading during the storm. Most critically, the opening was oriented approximately 15 degrees away from the true northwest, meaning the primary storm wind would strike the bluff face at an oblique angle rather than driving directly into the hollow's mouth. 3 walls, already built. Standing there in the cold with the storm visible on the horizon and the clock running, Eli felt something shift inside his chest that he could not immediately name. Not relief, not confidence, nothing as substantial as either of those. A small, hard thing. The recognition that the numbers which had been entirely against him 3 minutes ago had just changed slightly. He needed a fourth wall. He walked back to the wagon faster than he had left it. Colt turned his head as Eli returned and tracked him with the patient, slightly skeptical attention the old horse brought to most of Eli's decisions. Eli moved to the rear of the wagon and stood looking at it with the kind of vision he had developed over years of field repair work, not seeing what something was, but seeing what it could be made into. The wagon bed was approximately 7 feet wide by 12 feet long. The sideboards warped as they were still formed a continuous surface along each side. The frame beneath was intact. The cracked axle was on the rear assembly, not the bed frame itself. The oil tarp folded across the top of the load was approximately 8 feet by 10 feet, with a problematic seam along the upper left edge and two older patches that had held through multiple hard rains. It needed another patch before it would be reliable as a wind barrier. He had rivets in the toolkit and a coil of spare trace leather. It could be done. It would add time he didn't have to spare, but it had to be done. He started with the tarp. He pulled it off the load and spread it across the packed snow, locating the weak seam by running his hand along the surface and feeling for the slight give where the material had separated from the backing. He cut a strip of trace leather, approximately 10 inches long and 4 inches wide, from the end of the spare coil, folded it over the seam, and drove 4 copper rivets through the doubled leather and the tarp fabric with the carpenter's hammer, spacing them 2 inches apart. The work took 6 minutes. The patch was not elegant. It would hold. Then he began disassembling the wagon. The front axle assembly came apart in the sequence Dutch had taught all his crews for emergency field work. Linchpin first, then the king bolt, then the tongue brace. The tongue brace had been driven tight by 5 days of alternating temperature. The iron fitting had contracted in the cold and bonded to the wood with the stubbornness of metal that has found a comfortable position and resents being disturbed. Eli worked the cotter pin with a hammer and a nail set for nearly 4 minutes, fingers going progressively less useful inside his gloves before the pin finally sheared free with a crack that sounded wrong, too sharp, too complete, and the brace dropped. He checked the frame. The crack had run through the wood rather than the iron fitting, which was not ideal but left the frame usable. The rear pins followed, then the boards connecting the bed frame to the wheel assemblies. He worked methodically, not fast, was how you made mistakes that cost more time than they saved. The storm was coming regardless of how quickly he moved. The quality of his choices in the next 30 minutes would matter more than the speed of them. When the wagon bed was fully separated from the wheel assemblies, Eli rigged the rawhide rope through the front frame brace in a loop that would distribute pulling force across the width of the frame rather than concentrating it at a single point. He tied the other end across his shoulders in the configuration Dutch had called a freighter's harness, chest and shoulders carrying the primary load, hands free for balance and course correction. He had used this rig twice before in fieldwork situations. Both times it had worked. Both times it had also removed skin from the area below his shoulder blades. He tried Colt first, hitching the horse to the frame beside him, working in parallel. For approximately 40 seconds, this arrangement seemed viable. Then the first audible evidence of the approaching storm arrived, a low extended sound from the northern ridge, not yet wind, but the precursor to it, the sound of displaced air moving over stone at high altitude. It was not loud. It did not need to be. Colt heard it, and the horse's entire muscular system shifted from cooperative to survival in the time it took Eli to register the sound himself. The old horse lunged backward against the traces with enough force to pull the frame sideways and nearly off its line. Eli cut the hitch before the horse could pull the whole assembly over. Colt retreated 4 steps, then held trembling through the neck and shoulders, eyes wide and showing white at the inner corners. Easy. He did not touch the horse yet. Easy now. He kept his voice at a conversational level, matter of fact, the tone that communicated as much as tone could communicate anything to an animal operating on pure instinct, that the situation was known, that it was being managed, that panic was not the appropriate response. Colt's trembling reduced by a degree. Eli watched him for 5 more seconds, then turned back to the rope. He pulled alone. The wagon frame moved across the frozen ground with the grudging incremental resistance of something that had decided it belonged where it was. The broken front edge of the frame bit into the snow crust, with every foot of progress catching on buried rocks and frozen sage roots beneath the surface. Twice the whole load twisted sideways, and Eli had to stop, reposition, and restart each interruption, costing time he had already calculated he couldn't afford. The rope had worked through his coat by the first 100 feet and was beginning its work on the skin beneath. He could feel the burn of it across his upper back, a line of heat in all that cold, and he noted it the way you noted weather, as information, not as complaint. The storm wall was fully visible now without standing on the wagon bench to see it. It occupied the entire northern horizon, black at the crown, rolling white-gray at the leading edge, with horizontal snow already driving along the ridge surface in thin racing sheets. The wind had returned, not the eerie stillness from before, but real wind preliminary gusts moving across the trace in irregular bursts that carried enough force to push against his right side as he pulled. The temperature was dropping with a speed he could feel in his lungs, each inhale carrying more cold than the one before it. The basalt bluff was 50 yards away, then 40, then 20. At 15 yards, the frame caught hard on something beneath the snow, a rock, a root the edge of a buried drift, and stopped with a jarring solidity that transferred straight through the rope into his shoulders. He leaned forward, putting his full weight into the pull. Nothing. He shifted the angle, pulling slightly left to change the vector of force against whatever was holding the frame. The load shifted 6 inches, found a different resistance, and stopped again. He dropped to his knees, reached through the snow with both hands, and located the obstruction by feel a submerged granite outcrop about the size of a saddle with the front right corner of the wagon frame wedged against it. He worked the frame left by increments, hands in the snow, lifting and redirecting until the corner cleared the stone. The frame lurched forward. He grabbed the rope, found his footing pulled. The shadow of the basalt overhang passed over him. The hollow was close enough now that he could hear the difference in the wind outside the hollow. The gusts moved with open country freedom. Inside the shadow of the stone, the air was comparatively still, dampened by the walls and the overhang above. He pulled the frame the last 8 feet and let it down against the stone floor of the hollow with a sound that was part crash, part relief. He stood there for a moment with his hands on his knees, breathing. Not resting, he would not rest yet. There was too much to do before rest was something he was entitled to. Just breathing because his body had been running an account all morning and was beginning to present the bill. The first serious gust of the arriving storm rolled over the basalt ridge above him and drove a sheet of fine snow horizontal across the freight trace. Even inside the hollow's partial protection, Eli felt the change in pressure. The air itself had weight now, something directional and insistent, pressing against the south-facing rock face. The hollow held. The stone curved inward around him, and the wind passed over the top of the opening rather than driving straight in. 3 walls. He straightened and walked back out into the building when to retrieve Colt, the tarp, the rope, and the tools. There was still a 4th wall to build before the storm arrived in full, still every gap and seam to find and close, still the long work of turning a hollow in a rock face into something that the wind could not enter. He had perhaps 40 minutes, maybe 30. He was already moving. That was the thing about survival in mountain country that most people who hadn't lived it failed to understand. It was not dramatic. It was not a fight, not in the way stories made it sound. It was a list, a sequence of specific necessary tasks that had to be completed in the right order with whatever was available. The man who stood still and felt the weight of his situation rarely finished the list. The man who moved to the next item, then the next, then the next, that man sometimes came through. Eli Carver had been working through lists under bad conditions for 19 years. He was not done with this one yet. The storm wall hit the ridge while he was walking back toward the wagon. He did not see it happen. He felt it, a single concussive change in atmospheric pressure that passed through the air like the leading edge of something enormous and indifferent. The temperature dropped 6 degrees in 30 seconds. The wind stopped being gusts and became continuous, a sustained roar that arrived from the north and intended to stay. Colt screamed once, a high, sharp sound of pure animal terror, and then Eli had the horse by the halter, both hands pressing his forehead against the animal's jaw, talking in a steady stream of nothing. Words, the kind of sound that communicated presence rather than meaning. The horse fought him for 10 full seconds, all 4 legs seeking purchased body, trying to pivot away from the wall of sound and cold bearing down from the north. Eli held. He did not try to overpower the horse. He was not large enough, not strong enough, after the morning's work, all to win a contest of pure force against a panicking animal. He held on and stayed close and kept talking, and gradually the horse's breathing shifted from the ragged, catching rhythm of panic to something slower, something that acknowledged the presence of the man attached to it. He led Colt toward the hollow at a walk. The wind was at their backs now. That helped. Behind them, the freight trace had already begun to disappear beneath the first serious snowfall of the arriving storm, erased inch by inch as the blizzard settled onto the mountain like something that had been waiting a long time to arrive and intended to make itself comfortable. In the hollow beneath the basalt overhang, the fourth wall was still unbuilt, the gaps still open, the seams still waiting. The storm had arrived ahead of schedule, as storms in the Bitterroot country always did when they mattered most. Eli went to work. The wagon frame sat across the mouth of the hollow at an angle that was almost right. Almost was not enough. Eli could see the problem the moment he stepped back and looked at the placement with the critical detachment that good field work required, the detachment that ignored what you wanted to see in favor of what was actually there. The frame covered the central portion of the hollow's mouth well enough, the flat wagon bed surface facing outward into the wind, like the wall of a river barge run aground. But on the left side, where the basalt wall curved inward at a slight angle, a gap remained between the wagon's edge and the stone, perhaps 18 inches wide, running the full height of the frame. On the right side, a narrower gap of roughly 10 inches opened where the rock floor was not perfectly level, and the wagon frame sat slightly proud of the surface rather than flush against it. Two openings. Either one, in a storm of the magnitude now arriving, was enough to kill them both before morning. The wind was no longer arriving in gusts. It had become a single sustained pressure from the north, a continuous force that pressed against the basalt face above the hollow and sent veins of cold air down across the overhang's lip in thin, probing streams. Eli could feel these streams on the top of his head and across his shoulders, even inside the partial protection of the hollow cold, finding its way down the stone face, the way water found low ground following every contour, testing every edge. He positioned the wagon frame first, adjusting its angle so the left edge pressed as close to the curving wall as the irregular rock surface allowed, closing the larger gap to approximately 8 inches. Then he drove the first wagon peg, a hardwood stake from the repair kit 8 inches long, through a leather strap on the frame's left edge, hammering it into a crack in the basalt floor with the butt of the carpenter's hammer until it held fast. The crack in the stone accepted the peg with a grinding reluctance, and Eli hit it 4 more times past the point where it felt set, because in the next several hours this joint would be tested by forces he could not fully predict, and the consequences of its failure were not abstract. He pulled the patched oil tarp across the upper portion of the opening, next stretching it from the top of the wagon frame up to the rock overhang above. The overhang was not smooth, it was rough basalt with natural ledges and cracks running horizontally across its underside, which meant there were places to anchor the tarp's upper edge without driving hardware into solid rock. Eli wedged 3 pieces of split wagon board up under the overhang's lip, pressing the tarp fabric tight against the stone above them, then lashed each board in place with short lengths of rawhide rope passed through grommets in the tarp's edge. The tarp was not under tension yet. It hung slightly slack, which was intentional. A tarp under tight tension failed catastrophically when struck by sudden high-pressure wind pulling its anchors clean. A tarp with controlled slack deflected impact by absorbing it through movement before the force transferred to the fastening points. Dutch Reeves had taught him this distinction on the second winter they worked together, explaining it with the specificity that distinguished genuine expertise from accumulated habit. The old foreman had believed that most structural failures in field conditions were failures of concept rather than failures of materials. People understood that things needed to be strong, but they rarely understood the difference between strength that resisted force and strength that redirected it. Eli had been young enough at the time to receive the lesson without fully understanding its breadth. He understood it now. The right side gap required different thinking. The floor irregularity that created it was not correctable. He could not level the rock surface, so he needed material that could fill a 3-dimensional space rather than bridge a flat opening. He pulled the ruined harness blanket from the back of the wagon load, a piece of thick buffalo hide that had been May's purchase 4 years ago from a trader outside Deer Lodge. She had paid $3 for it, and Eli had questioned the price at the time, which was the kind of minor domestic negotiation that seemed significant in the moment and became weightless in retrospect. The hide was stiff from cold and smelled of horse hay, old sweat, the composite smell of working animals over years. He cut it into strips with his belt knife, folding each strip double before pressing it into the gap layer over layer until the opening had been reduced to a thin line rather than a passable space. He filled that thin line with frozen mud. The mud came from beneath the basalt wall, where the stone met the floor, a thin stratum of earth that had not fully frozen at depth because the rock above it retained just enough residual heat from the autumn to keep the ground beneath it workable. Eli scraped it out with the axe blade, collecting it in his gloved palm in the small quantities, then pressing it into the seam with his fingers, the way a mason worked mortar into a joint, not pushing straight in, but working at an angle that forced the material to compress and expand against both surfaces simultaneously. Cold mud had a short working window before it froze in place. He had perhaps 20 minutes of workability in each handful before it set, which meant he had to be precise. Every application counted. The first real gust of the storm's full pressure struck while he was still working the right side seam. It did not come from directly in front. It came from above, a downdraft off the basalt face above the overhang that hit the tarp's upper edge with a force that snapped the fabric outward with a crack as sharp as rifle fire. The sound arrived before the sensation, a single explosive report that registered in Eli's nervous system as gunshot before his reasoning caught up and identified it correctly. The left anchor board was ripped free from under the overhang lip by the tarp's outward snap, the rawhide lashing pulling through the grommet with a tearing sound, the board clattering across the stone floor and striking Colt's left foreleg. The horse exploded. There was no transitional phase, no escalation from startled to frightened to panicked. Colt went from standing to full reactive motion in an instant, forelegs driving against the stone floor, simultaneously body twisting hard to the right in an attempt to find the exit that his instincts were telling him existed somewhere in the dark enclosure. The horse's right shoulder struck the wagon frame with a force that shuddered through the entire structure, driving the frame 6 inches outward from its position against the left wall. The gap Eli had spent 20 minutes closing reopened. Eli moved toward the horse without thinking about it, because thinking about it would have produced hesitation, and hesitation was not available as an option. He got both arms around Colt's head, not trying to restrain the horse's full body movement, which was beyond his current physical capacity, but controlling the head, which controlled the neck, which influenced the body. He pressed his forehead against the flat bone above the horse's nose, keeping his own weight forward, staying in contact. Colt threw his head twice hard enough to lift Eli partially off his feet both times. The third attempt to throw the head found Eli's weight already adjusted for it, moving with the motion rather than against it. Easy now. The words came out in exactly the register he had not planned, lower than his speaking voice, paced differently with a cadence on the second word that belonged to someone else. He heard it before he understood it, the way you sometimes heard a memory with your ears before your mind had finished recognizing the source. May had said it with precisely that rhythm every morning when she went out to Colt in the winter months, the horse's breath fogging in the cold barn air, her voice carrying the flat matter-of-fact kindness she brought to all living things that needed settling. Not a question, not a request, a statement of what was going to happen next. Easy. Now. Eli said it again, same cadence, and felt Colt's neck stop fighting beneath his arms. The horse stood, trembling for another 30 seconds. The deep, muscular trembling of an animal whose body had committed fully to an emergency response and now had to stand down from it all, that chemistry with nowhere to go. Then the trembling, reduced by degrees, the breathing slowed, the muscles across the shoulders released their locked tension into something merely watchful. Eli held his position for a full minute piece when he thought it was safe to move because the cost of another explosion was higher than the cost of one extra minute of stillness. Then he went back to the tarp. The left anchor board had to be replaced. He had 2 spare boards in the load, short lengths of rough pine he carried for field repairs, and he took one of them out, pressed the tarp edge back up against the overhang, positioned the board against the stone, and drove it into place with his palm heel rather than the hammer, because the hammer's sound was a variable he did not want to reintroduce near Colt's nervous system right now. The board held. He wrapped the lashing twice rather than once through the grommet, adding a secondary loop around the board itself before tying off. It was not elegant engineering. It was the difference between a knot that might fail and a knot that had to fail twice. Outside, the storm had found its full voice. The sound was no longer the directional roar of wind encountering an obstacle. It had become environmental surrounding present in the stone beneath his boots as much as in the air. The basalt walls of the hollow transmitted the vibration of the blizzard as a low-frequency tremor that was felt rather than heard, a sub-bass presence that moved through solid material the way sound moved through water. Above the hollow, the freight trace would be invisible by now, buried under the first heavy deposition of the storm's load. Below the ridge, the draws would be filling fast with drifting snow carried off the exposed upper slopes. Eli worked the remaining gaps by a method that was part system, part instinct. He moved along the shelter's perimeter on his knees from the left wall junction across the bottom of the wagon frame, where it met the stone floor, to the right wall junction, pressing the flat of his palm against every surface he had sealed, feeling for the cold that indicated moving air rather than still cold. Still cold felt like a surface. Moving air felt like a presence, a quality of cold that was directed rather than ambient, that came from a specific origin toward a specific destination. He was looking for the directed cold. He found it at 3 locations. The first 2 were minor thin streams at the upper corners of the hide-stuffed right gap, which he addressed with wadded sage he had pulled from the load before the storm arrived, pressing it into the corners until the directed cold became still cold. The third location stopped him. It was beneath the wagon bed near the right center of the frame, where the warped sideboard created the lowest point of the structure's contact with the stone floor. The gap was not visible. The light inside the hollow had been failing for the past 20 minutes as the storm built, and the sky outside darkened toward a premature evening. But when Eli lowered his head to the level of the frame's bottom edge and turned his face toward the gap, the cold hit the side of his neck with a precision that belonged to something channeled. It was not the casual cold of a poorly insulated space. It was a knife blade of moving air, thin, targeted, cold enough to strip heat through wool, as though the fabric were not there. This was the lesson Dutch had been transmitting under the freight bridge all those years ago. Not philosophy mechanics. A sealed space did not cool uniformly. It leaked. The wind did not need the whole wall open. It needed one place where it could move, one path through which warm air could be carried out faster than 2 bodies and a horse could produce it. One gap the width of 2 fingers in the right location, with the right wind pressure behind it, was enough to drain the hollow of every degree of survivable warmth before morning. Eli clawed at the frozen ground beneath the wagon frame with his bare hands. He had removed his gloves to work the mud seam 20 minutes earlier, and not replace them because gloved hands could not feel the moving air with sufficient sensitivity. The stone floor under the wagon's edge was not soil. It was the same basalt as the walls, covered with a thin layer of accumulated mineral debris that had the consistency of coarse sand mixed with small, sharp fragments of rock. He drove his fingernails into this material and pulled it toward him, then packed what he could gather into the gap between the wagon frame's bottom edge and the stone floor, pressing it flat with his thumb, covering it with a layer of the remaining frozen mud, then another layer of the debris, working from outside the gap inward to close the channel from its intake end. The skin on his fingertips split open sometime during the second minute of this work. He felt it as a sharpness that registered, then receded into the background of all the other sensory information competing for attention. The cold at this depth of effort was not the clean cold of open air. It was the intimate cold of prolonged contact with frozen stone, the kind that moved through skin into the tissue beneath it, with the thoroughness of water finding its level. He added sage, then a folded strip of the remaining harness hide narrow enough to fit into the gap's depth, then a final packing of frozen mud pressed over the whole composite seal, with the heel of his palm, smooth flat edges pressed into the junction between wood and stone until the joint disappeared. He raised his head to the gap level and turned his face toward it. Nothing. Still cold, not directed cold. The channel was closed. Eli sat back on his heels. Both hands were bleeding from the fingertips, not dramatically small, specific wounds at the nail edges, already partially clotting in the cold. He tucked them under his arms inside the coat and held them against his body, waiting for the return of sensation that would confirm the blood was still moving adequately. The return, when it came, arrived as pain, which was the correct response. Pain meant the nerves were functional, the tissue was viable. He looked around the hollow. No light remained from outside. The storm had consumed whatever thin winter daylight had existed, replacing it with the lightless dark of a space sealed under heavy cloud and driven snow, a darkness without gradient, without the subtle distinctions of shade that normally allowed the eye to orient even in dim conditions. The hollow was simply black from the stone floor to the overhang above. Eli could hear Colt breathing behind him, a slow, regular sound that had settled back into the horse's working rhythm. He could hear the storm on the other side of the fourth wall, the constant bass roar of it punctuated by irregular, heavy impacts, when a gust of force hit the basalt face above them and sent the pressure differential across the overhang's lip in a wave. He could hear the tarp move when those impacts came, a controlled flex, not the explosive snap of earlier, the fabric absorbing and deflecting the way he had intended it to. What he could not feel for the first time since he had entered the hollow was moving air against his skin. The space inside the sealed hollow was cold. It was deeply, consistently bone-level cold, in the way of stone spaces in winter, the rock itself a reservoir of accumulated cold that radiated steadily inward, regardless of what happened to the air temperature. But the cold was still. It pressed against him from all directions equally, the passive cold of an enclosed space rather than the active cold of moving air, stripping heat from exposed surfaces. Dutch had called it the difference between winter and wind. Winter you could survive by generating heat. Wind took the heat before your body could use it. Inside this sealed space, winter was all that remained. Wind was on the other side of the fourth wall, looking for a way in. Eli moved back against the stone wall beneath the overhang, settled into a position with his back against the basalt, and Colt's flank 3 feet to his right, close enough to benefit from the horse's radiated body heat without crowding the animal. He pulled his knees up, tucked his damaged hands deeper inside his coat against his sides, pulled his hat brim down, tucked his chin. The storm found the shelter again 40 minutes later. A shift in wind direction, not dramatic perhaps, 20 degrees from northwest to more directly north, created a new pressure relationship with the hollow's mouth that the current configuration had not been designed for. The tarp's right side, which had been the leeward edge under the original wind vector, became partially windward, and the pressure differential across the wagon frame changed accordingly. Eli felt it as a sound, first a different quality of vibration in the wagon boards, higher in frequency, more insistent. Then a thin stream of cold air found his left cheek from somewhere above the wagon frame's right upper corner. He climbed back onto the wagon frame in complete darkness. This was the part of the night that required a different category of function than the work of building had required. Building had been a sequence of visible concrete problems with visible concrete solutions. This was navigation by touch alone in cold that had progressed over the past 2 hours from uncomfortable to damaging, the kind of cold that did not feel like much after the first hour, because the nerve endings in the extremities had deprioritized sensation in favor of the more fundamental work of keeping the core functional. Eli found the upper right corner of the frame by running his left hand along the top edge of the wagon bed from the center outward, his right hand braced against the tarp fabric for balance. The corner junction between the frame edge and the basalt wall was accessible but narrow, barely enough room to work both hands in the space. He felt along the junction until he located the specific point where the gap had opened a place where the tarp's right edge had pulled slightly away from the wagon frame's corner as the new wind pressure worked against the side he had not anchored as heavily. The secondary lashing he needed was 2 feet above his current hand position, reachable, but requiring him to shift his weight onto the frame's edge in a way that transferred significant load to the right side of the structure. The wagon frame rocked slightly as he did this, a movement of perhaps half an inch, but perceptible through the soles of his boots, a reminder that the whole assembly was resting on irregular stone rather than driven foundations. He moved slowly, distributing his weight across as much of the frame as possible, reaching up with one hand while the other gripped the tarp fabric for purchase. His right hand found the loose lashing by feel. He worked the knot with fingers that had the sensitivity of wood. He could feel gross pressure, but not the finer feedback of cord against cord that normal temperature hands would have. He tied the first knot by constructing it from memory rather than sensation, executing the sequence of movements that produced a reliable hitch, the way you might execute a familiar task in darkness when the mind knew the choreography well enough to run it without sensory confirmation. The knot slipped. He rebuilt it. It slipped again. The cord was stiff, with cold, resistant to the tight radius the knot required. On the third attempt, he added a half hitch above the primary knot before drawing it down, giving the assembly 2 points of engagement rather than one. He sat on the frame's edge for a moment after not moving, listening to the wind test the structure around him. The vibration in the wagon boards was different now, still present, but lower in frequency, less urgent, the boards moving as a unified structure rather than as individual pieces responding to local pressure. The repair had redistributed the load correctly. He climbed back down to the stone floor. Below him, a new draft crossed the floor from near the bottom of the frame, the consequence of the same wind shift that had caused the upper problem. Eli dropped to both knees without standing up fully and tracked the draft by moving his face slowly along the gap level between frame and floor until the cold sharpened against his left cheek with that directional precision that identified a channel rather than general permeation. The location was near the center of the frame's lower edge, where the previously packed mud and sage had held well, but the new pressure vector was pushing upward through a crack in the stone floor itself, a natural fracture in the basalt that ran diagonally under the wagon frame. It had not been a problem under the original wind direction. It was a problem now. He packed it with everything remaining in sequence. Sage first pushed deep into the crack with a nail used as a probe, then folded hide, pressing the sage down. Then the last of the workable frozen mud layered over the top and pressed into every surface junction. His fingers were past the point of bleeding. The wounds had sealed themselves in the cold, which sounded better than it was because it meant the tissue had stopped responding rather than that it had healed. He could accomplish the mechanical work required. The question of damage was a question for later in a warmer place when there was latitude to attend to it. Something changed in the sound of the storm while Eli was pressing the last layer of mud into the crack. He noticed it the way you noticed a clock stopping, not by hearing a new sound, but by registering the absence of a sound you had stopped consciously hearing because it had been so constant. A high-frequency component of the wind, a thin whistling that had been coming from somewhere along the right wall junction, was gone. He turned his face toward the right wall and waited. Nothing. The whistling did not return. He moved his palm slowly along the right wall junction and found no moving air, but he also found at the lower third of the junction a subtle resistance where his palm should have met a stone and gap, but instead met something that yielded slightly and then pushed back. Packed snow. The wind was depositing it against the outside of the shelter from the right side, the storm itself filling the gap from outside with the same driven powder it was using to bury everything else on the ridge. Eli held his palm against the packed material for several seconds, feeling for the cold draft that should have been there. The moving air was gone from this section, entirely replaced by the still cold of a gap that had been sealed not by him, but by the blizzard. He moved along the junction to the left, found another section that had been similarly filled. The storm was building its own wall outside his wall layer by layer, the driven powder finding every external gap and packing it with the indiscriminate efficiency of a force that did not distinguish between burying a road and insulating a shelter. The thing trying to kill him was sealing the gaps that would have allowed it to succeed. He had built the best fourth wall he could from what he had. The storm was finishing the job. He sat with this understanding in the dark for a time, not as a comfort, exactly. The cold still present, still deepening, Colt's radiated warmth, still the only thermal input available in the space, but as a recalibration of the relationship between himself and what was happening outside. He had not defeated the storm. He had not found a way to make the materials better than they were, or the gaps tighter than he could seal them. He had done sufficient work at sufficient quality, and then the storm had done the rest, and those two things together had produced a sealed pocket of still air in the middle of a blizzard that had already almost certainly killed men in better equipment on the same ridge tonight. Sufficient was not a word Eli Carver had typically found satisfying. It had always implied a shortfall, a compromise between what was needed and what was available. Sitting in the dark with blood dried on his fingertips and the warmth of a 14-year-old horse, keeping the temperature in the hollow above what it would have been without that animal, he understood for the first time that sufficient was not a lesser category of outcome. It was the category that contained the difference between alive and not alive. Everything above sufficient was preference. Sufficient itself was the whole game. The storm's behavior changed again around what Eli estimated was midnight. The sustained roar that had been present since the storm's full arrival shifted into something more irregular. Long periods of extreme intensity, followed by intervals of lesser but still serious wind, the pattern suggesting that the storm's core was moving rather than stationary, passing over the ridge, rather than sitting directly above it. This was good news in the abstract sense that it meant the storm had a direction of travel and therefore a far edge. It was bad news in the immediate sense that passing storm cores generated the most severe single gusts during the transition pressure differentials between the core and the trailing edge, producing extreme localized wind events. Three of these events struck the shelter in the next 2 hours. The first shook the entire structure hard enough that Eli felt it through the stone floor, the hollow itself vibrating at a frequency lower than sound, the basalt walls conducting the external force as physical movement. The wagon frame lurched against its pegs. Both upper anchor boards held. The tarp flexed hard against its lashings, took the load distributed it held. The second gust came from a slightly different angle and found the left wall junction driving a spike of cold air through the sage packing at the upper corner, before packing more snow against the outside of the gap and sealing itself within 20 seconds. Eli was moving toward the location before the cold spike had fully registered. He arrived to find the gap already resealing from outside. He added pressure to the inside face with his palm, compressing the existing packing material against the incoming snow, and held it there until the draft stopped. The third was the worst. It did not strike the shelter directly. It passed over the basalt ridge above the hollow with enough force to create a low-pressure zone immediately above the overhang, a momentary partial vacuum that attempted to pull the tarp upward rather than push it inward. The left anchor board screamed against the overhang rock. The rawhide lashing stretched, the grommet pulled through its reinforced ring, halfway before the gust passed and the pressure equalized. Eli sat on the wagon frame with his hands on the tarp's upper edge, adding what body weight he could manage to the anchor system until the structural crisis had passed. Then the storm began to quiet, not suddenly, not in a way that was initially distinguishable from another interval between intense gusts. But the intervals lengthened and the intense gusts did not return to full strength, and the deep vibration in the basalt floor decreased by a degree and then another degree. The tarp stopped flexing with that reactive urgency that communicated ongoing assault. The wagon board settled into a steadier resonance, still moving, still responding to wind pressure, but less violently, less urgently, less like a thing fighting to stay in place. Colt's breathing, which had been shallow throughout the worst of it, began to deepen. The horse shifted its weight from the braced, wide-legged stance it had held for hours back to the settled, hip-dropped posture of an animal that was no longer preparing for immediate emergency. In the dark, the sound of the horse returning to something like rest was more informative than any instrument. Eli stopped fighting. Not by choice exactly, more by the slow recognition that there was nothing left to fight. Every seam he could reach had been sealed. Every gap he had been able to address had been addressed. The shelter had taken the storm's full effort for the better part of 8 hours and had not broken. The fourth wall held, the still pocket of air held inside it, cold but motionless, alive with the slow, warm rhythm of Colt's breathing. He leaned back against the basalt wall, hands still tucked against his sides, and closed his eyes in the dark, which made no perceptible difference to the quality of the darkness, but felt like a permission he had not previously been able to grant himself. In the weeks since May's death, sleep had been a form of combat each night, producing the same sequence of images: the room above Halverson's store, the low-burning lamp, the bottles on the side table, the sound of breathing that gradually changed its character in ways that no amount of attention could prevent. He had begun to dread closing his eyes in the dark, because the dark always went to that room. Tonight, for the first time in 3 weeks, when Eli closed his eyes, there was no room. There was only the stone wall against his back, the cold pressing in from all directions. With equal weight, the sound of Colt breathing slowly in the dark beside him, and the distant but distinctly fading voice of the blizzard speaking to the mountain above them about things that no longer concerned what was sealed below. He slept without knowing he was doing it. Outside, the storm continued its work on the ridge, packing snow against every surface it could reach, filling every external gap in the fourth wall, with driven powder burying the wagon frame higher and higher, up its exposed face until what had been a human construction began to look from any external vantage point that still existed in that white obliterated world like a feature of the terrain itself, a dark seam in the basalt, a natural shadow in the stone face, something that had always been part of the mountain. The blizzard was thorough in this way. It erased what men built. What it could not reach, it covered. Inside the sealed hollow, two living things breathed slowly in the dark, and the air between them stayed still. The silence arrived before Eli understood it. He had been existing in a state that was not quite sleep for an indeterminate period, a condition the body imposed when it had exhausted its options somewhere below consciousness, but above the depth where dreaming occurred. There were no images in it, no lamp burning low in a corner room, no bottles on a side table, no sound of breathing changing its quality by degrees over the course of an afternoon. There was only the stone wall against his spine, the cold pressing inward from every direction, with the impartiality of something that had no particular opinion about him, and the slow rhythmic sound of Colt existing somewhere in the dark to his right. What pulled him back was the absence of something that had been so constant, he had stopped registering it as a separate phenomenon. The roaring was gone. Not reduced, gone, replaced by a quality of quiet that was not ordinary quiet, but the specific silence that followed extreme sound, the silence of a space that had been under continuous acoustic pressure for hours and was now released from it. His ears felt the difference before his mind caught up a slight alteration in pressure, a new emptiness in the frequency range the storm had been occupying. Eli opened his eyes. The darkness inside the hollow was unchanged. Black was black, but something in the air had shifted from the compressed, vibrating quality of a sealed space under assault to something more settled. The cold pressed inward with the same consistency as before, but without the sub-bass tremor in the stone floor that had been present throughout the night. He reached out with his left hand and touched the wagon frame beside him. The wood was rigid, still no longer conducting vibration through its structure. The tarp above him was motionless. He sat without moving for several minutes, listening past the silence for the storm's return. Mountain blizzards in the Bitterroot country did not always end. They paused, regrouped, came back with a different character, sometimes worse for the interruption. He had seen this happen twice in his years on the mountain routes, a deceptive calm that drew men out of shelter before the second phase arrived. He was not going to be drawn out. He sat with his back against the basalt wall, and he listened, and the silence held. Colt shifted weight somewhere in the dark, sound of a hoof repositioning on stone, the creak of the horse's joints settling into a new stance. Then the slow, long exhale of an animal releasing tension it had been holding for a significant time. Eli reached toward the sound, found the horse's shoulder by feel, left his hand resting against the warm coat. The muscle beneath his palm was relaxed. An animal's body knew things before a man's reasoning could confirm them. The storm was finished. He began working on the exit. The tarp's lower edge, where it met the wagon frame at the shelter's base, had been pressed outward by accumulated snow from outside. When Eli ran his hand along this junction, he found the fabric rigid with cold, but not under tension. The snow was holding it from outside rather than wind pressing it, which meant the drift had built substantially during the night. He worked the lower lashing free from its peg, rolled the tarp edge upward to create a gap at the base level, then reached through into the exterior face of the packed snow and drove his fist into it. The snow resisted not the light resistance of fresh powder, but the consolidated resistance of material that had been deposited under pressure, compacted by wind, settled by time. His fist broke through after the third strike, and cold air spilled through the opening, clean and still. Still, not moving, no wind pressure behind it. He enlarged the opening with his forearm, pulling broken snow inward in chunks that fell onto the hollow floor. The drift's exterior face was perhaps 4 feet from the wagon frame, meaning the snow had built up that depth against the shelter's outside wall overnight. He carved an opening large enough to pass his shoulders through, then sat for a moment at the edge of it. Through the gap, he could see nothing, so yet. The exterior was a uniform gray-white, a lightless but non-dark quality that suggested the world outside the hollow existed somewhere in the hour between true night and functional dawn. Eli went through feet first, pushing himself backward through the carved opening, keeping his face away from the snow that crumbled inward around him. He emerged into the exterior drift up to his waist, the snow compacted enough to bear his weight, when he pressed his arms against its surface and pushed himself upright. He stood knee-deep in the drift that had formed against the shelter's face and looked north. The ridge was white in every direction that could be called a direction. The freight trace was gone, not obscured, not drifted over in patches, but completely erased. The terrain resurfaced by the storm's deposition into a smooth, continuous white that eliminated every landmark Eli could recall from the previous morning. The basalt outcrops to the northwest were half buried, their dark faces reduced to irregular shadows beneath accumulated snow. The sky above the ridge was the color of old pewter flat, but not pressurized, carrying the motionless quality of a sky that had spent its energy and returned to neutral. No wind moved, no snow fell. The world had the absolute stillness of a landscape that had been comprehensively rearranged and not yet disturbed by anything living. Nothing moved across the visible extent of the ridge. There were no tracks, no marks, no evidence of any other presence on this section of the mountain. The blizzard had come through with the thoroughness of something that intended to be the last word on the subject. He turned back to look at the shelter. What he saw required a moment to parse. The hollow that he had spent the previous afternoon converting into a livable space was nearly invisible. The snow had drifted against the wagon frame's exterior face to a depth that covered all but the top 4 inches of the wood. The tarp, which had been a recognizable piece of fabricated material when he had last seen its exterior surface, was now pressed against the drift face in a configuration that made it look like a pale stone shelf frozen into the basalt shadow. The lashings were buried. The peg seams were buried. The entire construction had been incorporated into the ridgeline's winter surface so completely that from 20 feet away, standing where Eli now stood, there was nothing to indicate that anything had been built there. It looked like a shadow in the rock, a natural concavity in the basalt face partially filled with windblown snow. He stood looking at it for a long time. In 19 years of mountain freight work, he had built temporary shelters in emergency conditions, perhaps a dozen times lean-to snow trenches, brush windbreaks, once a dugout in a clay bank east of the divide, that had kept 4 men functional through a 2-day blow. None of those structures had disappeared the way this one had. They had all remained recognizably human things, things built by hands in response to need. This was different. The storm had done something to this hollow that went beyond burying it. It had absorbed it, made it part of the landscape's own logic, incorporated into the basalt ridge, as though the construction had happened at geological rather than human scale. Eli thought about the men who had died on this ridge last night. He did not know their names. He would learn some of them in the coming days at trading posts and ranch stops through the word-of-mouth transmission that served mountain communities in the absence of reliable news delivery. He knew without needing to be told that there had been deaths. The storm had been too severe, the routes too exposed, the margin for error too narrow for everyone on the mountain to have come through it. Some men had tried to outrun it and hadn't managed the distance. Some had found insufficient shelter. Some had found no shelter at all. The difference between those men and this hollow beneath the basalt overhang was not quality of materials. It was not physical strength or extraordinary endurance. It was the gap under the wagon frame that Eli had found by feel in the dark, after his fingers were already split open from earlier work, the gap no wider than 2 fingers that would have leaked the hollow's warmth into the blizzard in a thin, invisible stream all night long if it had remained open. That specific small thing found at the right moment because a dead man's lesson about the real nature of cold had been carried forward for 19 years. In one freighter's memory was the operating difference. He stepped back to the shelter opening, reached inside, found Colt's halter by feel, and guided the old horse out through the enlarged gap. Colt emerged into the white morning with the careful deliberateness of an animal that had spent the night in a space barely large enough to accommodate it, testing each foot placement before committing weight. The horse paused beside the drift and raised its head, drawing the cold, clean air in the long poles, nostrils flaring wide. Its winter coat was rough with the compression of hours pressed against the stone wall, and the horse's ribs were slightly more visible than they had been the previous morning. The night's metabolic cost of maintaining body temperature against deep cold was legible on the animal's frame. But Colt's eyes were clear, its movement deliberate rather than impaired its ears, moving with the normal investigative rotation of a horse, taking inventory of a changed environment. Eli rested one hand briefly on the horse's neck. Nothing needed to be said about what the horse had contributed to the night's survival. Its body heat in that sealed space, the steady rhythm of its breathing, providing both thermal input and the kind of low-frequency sensory grounding that kept a man's mind from going to unproductive places during the worst hours. Working animals in mountain country were not sentimental subjects among the men who depended on them. The relationship was practical, understood by both parties in their respective ways, honored by the quality of care rather than by declaration. He retrieved the minimal load from inside the hollow, the bedroll, the toolkit, the provisions bag, the small axe. The cast iron skillet had frozen to the stone floor where it had sat through the night, and Eli had to work it free with the axe handle before he could move it. Then he repacked the wagon frame's cargo area with what could be secured there and began the work of reassembly. The wheel assemblies had remained where he had left them the previous afternoon, half buried in the drift that had formed across the freight trace near the hollow's entrance. He dug them out, dragged them to the hollow one at a time, and began the reverse sequence of the disassembly rear mounting. First, then front axle, then tongue brace. The cracked wood in the tongue brace assembly was more pronounced after the night's temperature, cycling the fracture that had run through the grain during yesterday's disassembly, now visibly wider. He wrapped it in 2 layers of rawhide soaked in spit, the only liquid available, at working temperature, pulled tight and tied off. It would hold for the remaining distance to Frank's ranch under careful management. It had no obligation to hold beyond that. The sun came over the eastern ridge line while he was reconnecting the front axle, appearing not as a dramatic arrival, but as a gradual brightening of the sky's pewter color that eventually resolved into identifiable light. It fell across the white landscape without warmth, the angular winter sun of high altitude in December, providing visibility rather than temperature, but it provided sufficient light to work by without the squinting difficulty of operating in the flat gray of overcast dawn. By mid-morning, he had the wagon reassembled, colt hitched to the tongue, the load secured. He stood at the hollow's entrance one final time, looking at what remained. The interior of the space stripped of the wagon frame and tarp was just a hollow in basalt rock. Again, stone floor, curved walls, shallow overhang. The packed seams along the lower edges were visible, the composite material of sage hide strips, frozen mud pressed into junctions between stone and the now removed wagon frame, already beginning to slump slightly as the cold released its grip on the mud component. By spring, the freeze-thaw cycles would work most of it loose. By summer, no trace would remain of what had been built here. The hollow would return to what it had been before Eli Carver had walked along the bluff face in the last hour before a blizzard and looked at it as a problem to be solved rather than a feature of landscape to be passed. He placed his gloved hand flat against the basalt wall at the hollow's entrance. The stone was cold through the leather. It had been cold through all the hours of the night while the storm worked on the other side of what he had placed across its mouth. The stone had done its portion of the work without being asked, without being directed, simply by being what it was. Old, dense, indifferent to everything that happened around it, offering its walls to whoever had the sense to use them. Eli thought about the wagon, about what Wallace Peck had said in the Garnet Basin freight yard firewood, organized to look like a wagon, and about the way the same wood had sat across the mouth of this hollow through 8 hours of a mountain blizzard without failing. The cracked axle, the warped boards, the wheel sitting 4 degrees off, true, none of it had been relevant to what the wagon had ultimately been asked to do. It had been asked to stand between a man and the wind. The wind had been pushing on it all night with considerable conviction, and the wagon had declined to move. Whatever Peck had seen in that freight yard, he had been evaluating the wrong properties for the wrong application. May had bought the harness blanket that had gone into the right side gap, $3 from a trader outside Deer Lodge, and Eli had questioned the price. The hide had been cut into strips and pressed into a seam in a hollow under a basalt ridge in the middle of a blizzard, and those strips had held that seam through the night, and that seam had been part of why the hollow stayed sealed. And the hollow staying sealed had been the difference. $3. The arithmetic of survival was not a system you could optimize in advance. You carried what you carried, and sometimes what you carried turned out to be precisely what the moment required. He turned away from the hollow, took Colt's lead rope, and started south through the white silence. The freight trace was not recoverable. As a navigable road, the storm had deposited too much to allow wheeled traffic through the upper portion of the route, without considerable digging. Eli worked along the estimated line of the trace using the terrain features he knew from 30 crossings, the relationship between ridge lines and slope angles serving as navigation in the absence of the road itself. Where the drift depth was manageable, he drove the wagon through. Where it was not, he dug with the shovel, cutting a path wide enough for the wagon's wheels. The work was slow, exhausting, necessary. He did not think about it as difficult. He thought about it as the next item on the list. A mile and a half south of the hollow, he came across the remnants of a freight sled partially visible above the snowline. The sled's runners were intact, but the cargo bed had been stripped not by the storm by the driver, who had clearly jettisoned the load to lighten the rig before attempting to run. The harness was still attached to the front coupling, traces cut clean near the collar ring. The horse gone. Boot prints leading southeast, already half filled with blown powder, spoke of a man who had made a decision and committed to it. Whether that decision had worked out was information that would arrive later in fragments through other people. Eli left the abandoned sled and continued south. By late afternoon of the first day out, he was in terrain low enough that the freight trace had survived the storm in passable condition, compacted by drifting, but not buried beyond navigability. The sky had cleared to a flat winter blue by midday, offering better visibility, but dropping the temperature further as the cloud insulation departed. He kept moving until the light failed, then made a fireless camp in a shallow draw where a stand of scrub pine offered partial windbreak. The night was deeply cold, but quiet. He slept in the bedroll with Colt standing close by the horse's body, blocking the north-facing exposure. He did not dream of the room above Halverson's store. He woke to the same pewter sky as the previous morning, found his water canteen functional, because he had kept it inside the coat through the night, ate 2 biscuits with a strip of dried beef, and started again. On the second day, he crossed the tracks of a recovery crew, moving north 4 men on horseback with a pack mule, carrying canvas stretchers, moving with the businesslike efficiency of people who had a specific task and did not expect the task to be pleasant. They exchanged only the information that was immediately useful. The crew was working the upper north-south trace looking for a freighter named Arden, who had been reported overdue from 2 days before the storm. Eli told them he had seen no one on that section of the route. They thanked him with a nod and continued north. He watched them go for a moment, then turned south. The third day brought a small settlement, a crossroads with a general store, a livery, a structure that served as a combination post office and trading post. The storekeeper was a woman in her 50s named Hargrove, who ran the place with the quiet competence of someone who had been managing a remote outpost long enough to have stopped noticing the difficulty of it. She sold him a tin of beans, a length of salt pork, 2 candles. She told him the storm had been the worst since 1883 by her count, which she maintained in a ledger she kept specifically for weather events, because, as she explained without drama, it was useful information to have in the mountains. He paid for the provisions, accepted a cup of coffee that was near boiling, and tasted of chicory and smoke, drank it beside her stove in silence. The warmth worked through his coat into the muscle and bone beneath it, with a quality that was almost painful in its contrast to the cold of the previous days. The way light was painful after extended darkness, the body requiring time to readjust to conditions it had been built for. She asked where he was headed. Frank Carver's ranch, South Valley. She nodded. She knew the ranch knew Frank Carver by name and reputation as a competent man who ran a well-maintained operation. She told him the lower valley road was open passable for wheeled vehicles. The storm had hit hardest on the upper ridges, where the terrain offered no protection. He thanked her. She refilled the coffee cup without being asked, which was the kind of hospitality that did not require acknowledgement beyond accepting it. On the 4th day, he came down out of the foothills into the valley proper. The landscape change was abrupt in the way that transitions from mountain terrain to valley floor were always abrupt, 1 mile of descent through the last of the conifer belt. Then the ridge gave way, and the whole southern valley opened below him, wide and white under its winter covering, but recognizably domestic in a way the ridge country above it was not. Fenced pastures, their wire lines traced by the snow that had accumulated on the top strand. A frozen creek following its usual course, its surface a blue-white line cutting through the valley floor. Smoke from chimneys rising straight up in the still afternoon air. The straightness of it confirming what the absence of wind against Eli's face had been telling him for the past 2 hours. Frank Carver's ranch was visible from the ridge descent, a cluster of structures. Barn main house, two outbuildings arranged with the practical geometry of a working operation that had been developed over time according to use rather than aesthetic principle. The barn was large enough to suggest a substantial operation. The fencing was in good repair, even in winter. A woodpile beside the main house was stacked high enough to indicate either substantial preparation or substantial anxiety about the coal season, and in mountain country, the two were not always distinguishable. Eli came down the approach road in the last hour of afternoon light, the low sun throwing long blue shadows across the snow ahead of him. His coat was stiff with the accumulated freeze of 4 days' travel. The beard he had not maintained since leaving Garnet Basin had grown enough to collect frost at the collar line during the coldest hours, and while the frost had melted during the warmth of midday travel, it had refrozen by evening each day, giving his appearance a quality that would have concerned anyone who had not seen men come off the mountain in winter before. Colt walked with the deliberate, steady pace of an animal that had been working hard for a long time and was aware that the end was close, not hurrying, not flagging, simply continuing at the pace that could be sustained, which was the only pace that mattered over long distances. Frank Carver came out of the barn when the wagon came through the gate. He walked 6 steps toward the approaching wagon, then stopped. Not with the posture of someone reacting to an unexpected arrival, with the posture of someone managing a collision between what they had prepared themselves to believe and what they were now being asked to see instead. Frank had heard about the storm. He had heard the extent of it from the riders and travelers who had been passing through the valley since the storm cleared each account, adding to the picture of what the upper ridge country had experienced. He had heard enough to form a conclusion about what was likely, and the conclusion he had formed had involved a spring search rather than a winter arrival. The man now sitting on the wagon seat bore his cousin's face, occupied his cousin's upright posture, on a wagon bench, handled the reins with his cousin's characteristic economy of movement. But Frank's eyes were doing the work of confirming what his expectations had already ruled out. Eli climbed down from the wagon. His joints had stiffened during the afternoon's travel, the accumulated cold of 4 days having settled into the places where bone met bone with a persistence that would require several days of warmth to fully address. He moved carefully but without drama, tying Colt's lead to the fence post nearest the gate before turning to face Frank. His cousin's face was doing the thing that faces did when the mind was rapidly revising a significant assumption, the expressions moving across it in quick succession: disbelief, recognition, relief. Something that in a man less accustomed to controlling his reactions might have become visible emotion. All of it cycling through in the space of a few seconds before settling into the careful neutral of a man who had decided the appropriate response was to let the other man speak first. Inside the ranch house, the iron stove had been running since morning, and the accumulated warmth of it struck Eli's face when he stepped through the door like a physical thing, a presence the opposite of the basalt walls, cold, the same principle of radiated temperature applied in the other direction. He stood in the doorway for a moment longer than necessary, experiencing the warmth as a fact before moving into the room. Frank's boy Thomas, perhaps 12, with his father's wide-set eyes and the unself-conscious attentiveness of a child who has grown up in a place where paying attention to what adults were doing had practical value, took Colt to the barn without being asked, which told Eli something useful about how Frank ran his household. Frank set coffee on the stove without discussion. The two men sat at the kitchen table and Eli talked while the coffee heated. He described the storm wall from the wagon bench, Colt stopping before the visible signs had registered. He described the 3 hollows, the one that worked. He described the wagon disassembly, the tarp repair, the ceiling sequence. He described the draft under the wagon frame in the dark and the work of closing it with damaged hands. He described Colt's body heat through the night, the storm packing snow into the external gaps, the silence arriving before the understanding of it. Frank listened. He was a good listener in the way that men who had spent significant time in their own company often were, not passive but fully present, asking nothing until the account had reached its natural conclusion. When it did, he turned his coffee cup slowly on the table surface, looking at it rather than at Eli for a moment. Then Frank looked up with the directness of a man asking the question that had been present through the entire story: "How'd you know it would hold?" Eli looked at the coffee in his own cup, steam rising from the surface in slow, unhurried curls. He looked past it to where Colt was visible through the kitchen window, the old horse standing in the lit interior of Frank's barn, while Thomas forked hay into the stall's corner. Colt's head was already down attending to the hay with the focused appreciation of an animal that had been running on insufficient fuel for 4 days. The question deserved an honest answer, which meant it deserved a moment of consideration before the answer was given. Eli had not known the shelter would hold. Knowing was not the category the situation had belonged to. What he had known was the gap under the wagon frame found by Phil in the dark. He had known the lesson Dutch Reeves had transmitted 20 years earlier, beneath a freight bridge at Elk Creek Pass carried forward through all the years between then and a basalt hollow in the winter of 1891. He had known that a shelter did not need to be strong. It needed to be closed, and that closed was not a condition you achieved once, but a condition you maintained seam by seam through every hour that the wind was trying to find the one you had missed. His voice, when it came, was quieter than his speaking voice usually ran. Didn't need it strong. He paused once the pause of a man arriving at the end of a conclusion he had been working toward without knowing it. Just needed it closed. Frank sat with that for a moment. Then he set down his coffee cup with the care of a man placing something cribusely rather than merely putting it down. He nodded, not the nod of someone who had just received information, but the nod of someone whose understanding of a question had shifted beneath them. Without warning, the way ground shifted in a spring thaw. Everything that had seemed solid suddenly revealed to be resting on something that moved. That night, Eli slept in the room Frank showed him to, a spare room with a wool blanket, on a rope frame bed, a small window facing east, a rag rug on the plank floor. The room was warm from the stove heat migrating through the walls. He lay in the dark with the blanket's weight across him and listened to the house settle into its nighttime sounds. The tick of cooling iron in the stove, the distant sound of horses in the barn shifting in their stalls. The wind outside that tonight was ordinary wind, moving through the eaves with the mild industry of weather that had no ambitions beyond itself. He did not dream of the room above Halverson's store. He did not hear the sound of breathing changing its character in the afternoon light. He did not see the lamp burning low in the corner, the bottles on the side table, the stillness that had entered the room in the evening and not departed. He dreamed of the hollow beneath the basalt ridge, not the night inside it the morning, the dark seam in the snow-covered rock face, the tarp frozen into the drift surface like pale stone, the complete erasure of every human decision that had gone into that structure, covered over and incorporated the mountain, claiming it for its own in the hours between darkness and dawn. He had looked at it and understood that he had not won anything. He had built 4 walls from what remained. He had closed the seams one at a time. He had stayed inside the boundary he had made while the storm worked on the outside of it, and in the morning, the storm was gone and he was not. That was the complete account. The cracked axle had been part of the 4th wall. The $3 harness blanket had been part of the 4th wall. The tarp with its twice-patched seam had been part of the 4th wall. Dutch Reeves's lesson, carried forward through 20 years of ordinary work and extraordinary weather, had been part of the 4th wall. May's voice in the rhythm of 2 words spoken to a frightened horse in the dark had been part of something he could not name as cleanly as a wall, but which had been present through the night as surely as the stone. When he woke, light was coming through the east-facing window, with the low, clear quality of a December sunrise, actual sunlight, the kind with an angle to it different from the flat gray illumination of the ridge. He was 50 miles from the worst of it, in a warm room with work available and no questions that needed immediate answering. It was not a triumphant accounting. It was not a restored life or a replaced loss. It was a morning with the day outside waiting to be entered. He got up, put his feet on the rag rug, reached for his coat. In the years that followed in the trading posts and ranch kitchens and way station stoves, where the story of the blizzard of 1891 was told, the name Eli Carver appeared in a sentence, not the sentence of the man who defeated winter, not the sentence of the man whose survival was miraculous or attributable to some quality that other men lacked. It appeared in the sentence of the man who understood what a shelter actually needed to do, which was a different sentence, a more useful one, a sentence that the men who heard it sometimes carried forward into their own winters and applied in ways that had nothing to do with basalt rock or oil tarps or the freight trace east of the Bitterroot Range. The blizzard had killed stronger men and better equipment on the same ridge that night. It had found their gaps. It had moved through their shelters the way it moved through everything that was not fully closed against it, carrying warmth away in thin, invisible streams until there was none left to carry. Eli Carver's first shelter had not been strong. It had not been beautiful or well made, or constructed from materials that were adequate to the purpose in any conventional assessment. It had been a cracked wagon frame, a twice-patched tarp, $3 of harness, hide-frozen mud, pressed into stone joints by hands that were past the point of reliable sensation, and four walls placed between two living things and the wind that was trying to reach them. The wind had not reached them. That was all. In mountain country, that was everything.